Why was I on here talking and I didn't even realize that I didn't put myself?
It's one of them technology days.
And I was like, oh, I got to put myself in the live stream, I guess.
That would help. That would help.
Oh my goodness, that is so funny. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade, and we have switched platforms. So we were on Instagram, and Instagram just was not loving us today. So we decided we would come over here to Facebook and YouTube, and we are streaming from Facebook and YouTube. And Dr. Lewis, hold on for 1 minute. I always like to share it on my newsfeed on my page. Discussing.
Look at you multitasking. We are doing the Facebook, posting, talking all at the same time, checking the feeds. We're going to talk about how this works for somebody with ADD. It might be a little bit of a challenge.
Well, and then the other thing, yeah, so actually, look, remind me, I want us to talk about processing speed and what that means, and then how in multitasking and how that can show up, because that can be really fun, Okay, so everyone, again, thank you for showing up. I guess that's Alethea saying hi, Dr. Lewis.
Hi, I don't see anyone or any
you won't see it right now. We had one person on there, but then it looked like they went away. So I guess our Instagram people didn't come on over, but that's okay. We'll record it and then I can put it back on Instagram for those that want to be able to see it. Again, my name is Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I am the director of A Healing Paradigm. We are based in Muskogee Territory, which is also known as Atlanta, Georgia. And I am excited about this conversation. I think it is a really important conversation, particularly for people of African descent, and am excited about my colleague who has done lots of stuff with me. And today we're doing a whole new topic that we have talked about on a personal level, but haven't talked about professionally, and that is ADHD. And I just put out a simple title, hey, whether or not ADHD is real. And so this is my colleague, Dr. Ma'at E. Lewis. She is a licensed psychologist. She is also an associate professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And she is a mother. She is an initiated priest in the Kemetic yoga tradition. She is initiate. I always say initiated priest. Initiated in the Kemetic yoga tradition, and she's a amazing breathwork facilitator, but that's a whole other conversation that we can talk about at another time. If you haven't seen her discuss breathwork, look on our YouTube channel at ahealingparadigm.com. She has a great video where she's actually talking about that and the importance of breath and being able to use breath for healing as people of African descent. So thank you, Dr. Lewis, for coming today.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you and to join Healing Paradigm.
And thank you for helping us get through, being patient as we get through technical challenges.
None but things.
Okay, so let's start out and just answer the question up front. I'm gonna let you answer first, and I'll tell you my answer. Is ADHD real? Let's just start with that.
Yes, it's a real thing. Yes, it is real. And it is affecting many people of African descent. So that's my initial answer.
And I will agree with you. Yes, ADHD is real. And I do think it is impacting lots of folks, whether they know it or not. And so we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the controversy and some of the ways in which people get pathologized around their attention issues. And we'll get into that. But tell me for yourself, how did you get to the point, just as a psychologist? And I think it would be important to parallel this in terms of what I didn't say about you is that your focus, your orientation in terms of psychology is from an African-centered lens. So how did a psychologist who was board certified in African-centered psychology, how did you come to this conclusion that this thing that it seems like a lot of Black children get labeled with, how did you decide like, yes, ADHD is something that's real?
So before I go to that, can you just tell me when you were on Instagram and you asked people the question of whether or not ADHD was real, what were some of the answers that people were giving?
Yes, no, and in between. So
okay.
yes, no, I don't know. And that somewhat, but then not at the level that people are being pathologized. And then I also asked a question of whether or not people need medication. And I can't remember if anybody said yes. I know that a lot of people said alternative, in extreme, one person said in extreme cases, maybe they need medication, but for the most part, people talk about alternatives to psychotropic pharmaceutical medication.
Okay, great. So first, let's sort of say the name, right? Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, right? Also called ADHD. It is a neurological disorder, and it causes a range of changes in behaviors and behavioral problems. Before we sort of go more into what it is, I'll say that I became aware of it initially when I was in graduate school and receiving training, right? Learning about different psychological disorders, but, sort of got just a very basic introduction to it. And I didn't have a specialization in working with children. So it wasn't an area that I had a lot of in-depth knowledge about. And then in 2017, and part of this story is a very personal story, began getting feedback from my child's teacher that he was having trouble in pre-K, in childcare, and that they thought maybe he needed some early intervention. He wasn't bad, he wasn't disruptive, but he would not sit still. He was just a ball of energy. Yes. And, and everyone loved him, and his personality was magnetic, but, people just were like, wow, he has a lot of energy. And so for several years, he was in childcare and in early intervention programs, just trying to sort of help him stay on point. And we hadn't actually even talked about what ADHD was, and nobody really even said it. And then about 2 years later, I went to the pediatrician, and someone said, well, maybe you might want to get assessment ADHD. And I got a referral to a clinic, and I'll say more about that clinic later. And they did a combination of psychological tests, so tests sort of assessing the brain. And they did this thing called SPECT scans. So they did brain scans where they assessed and looked at the functioning of his brain. Now, at the same time that he went through this testing, when I first read the criteria and I used this book, somebody told me, well, get this book. And I don't have any affiliation, but this is the book I used, Healing ADD by Daniel Amen.
We can't open up. Hold on, put it right. I don't know where your camera. No, totally. Go back towards your face.
There we go.
Yep, there you go. Boom. Yeah. Healing ADHD. ADD.
Yeah. And so I started reading this book, and I'm speaking as a mother, who's a psychologist. The very first page laid out these 7 types of ADD. And so I started reading, and I thought, wow, some of that kind of sounds like me. And so I had the assessment done also at the same time that my son did it, and also had it done because I was like, they're not going to do no assessment on him without me knowing exactly what they're doing. And the results came back sort of confirming that both of us could be diagnosed with ADHD. And so it was through this very personal process. And of course, being a psychologist, being a mental health practitioner, my first thought was, well, how come I didn't realize that? But there was definitely a moment where my life flashed before me. And I started seeing how so many aspects of my educational experience and my interpersonal experiences made sense. like that I would had, had either challenges in life or interpersonal things that happened that just made sense. And so, it became very real. And that was very affirming. Just to give the one example in terms of the earliest sort of way in which it made sense was in kindergarten, right?
For you or for your son?
So for me, right? So
Okay.
I said that my son's assessment initial concerns came in, pre-kindergarten. For me, kindergarten, there was the experience, and I have really, memories of coming home after kindergarten, my mother putting the alphabet up on the refrigerator and me having to like over and over again, like practice and try to study to remember the alphabet. So there were some early educational challenges and difficulties that at that time, it was just like, oh, she's just having some struggles. And we know that there are different ways in which girls and boys get perceived in terms of having ADD. And so as a little girl, I was, a relatively, again, a good kid and had intelligence, but just struggled in various areas. By middle school, elementary school, I went to a desegregated school. So in the early 80s, late 70s and early 80s. And I went to a magnet school where no walls, no structured classroom. Everybody got to be together, 4th and 5th and 6th grade students were all together. And at times I was, really lost. And I remember one day, sort of early in that experience, coming home from school and just like agonizing over having to do homework. Not because I didn't want to do it or wasn't interested, but it took me a long time. Like any task that I needed to do, like it would take a long time. And so fortunately, I started to develop really good study habits and learned that if I was going to retain any information, I not only had to read the book, highlight and take notes in order to be able to just, retain and get the information in. And what that indicated and what the problems in kindergarten indicated was a problem in focus. So I don't know, maybe I might say a little bit about ADD and types of ADD and what it is and why those things, matter and make it real.
Well, and I wonder, if it's okay, I wanted to kind of share my experience as I listened to you. Yeah. My first experience with ADHD, I heard the term a lot. And before I went into grad school, I was involved in a lot of political movements in circles. Now people call them woke. Back then we called them African-centered circles. Lots of political movements where there was a lot of push against things that were around labeling people of African descent, particularly Black children, really pushes against white supremacy and oppressive diagnostic categories and pathologizing people. So I went into my doctoral program with the firm belief that ADHD was was a label that was put on Black children, and it was extremely problematic and very, very harmful. And I was a mother already. I was a mother raising children in this doctoral program. And when I started my doctoral program, my kids were 5 and 7 when I started, or 3 and 5. 3 and 5, I'm sorry. And so, they were still young, but I, had some experience at that point of being a mom. And so I remember working for a psychologist. And again, I'm in Muskogee territory, Atlanta, Georgia. And there's lots of Black psychologists that you can find in Atlanta, but not necessarily outside in the rural areas. So there was this grandma that brought her Black grandson, drove an hour and a half to get to us because she wanted a Black male psychologist to test her child. And because all the psychologists down there in rural Georgia where she were telling her that her grandchild had ADHD. And she just was like, basically she was saying, I'm not gonna let these white people label my Black grandchild.
Yeah.
So she drove him up here, and my supervisor had a lot of confidence in me and my ability to do assessments supervised under him. And so he is the one that told me to do this assessment for this little boy. So this 10-year-old boy comes in, and I'm like, my radical, yeah, we're going to take assessment, take it back, and be able to do all this great stuff for Black children and show that these systems are not going to pathologize our children. And I remember that experience clearly with that little Black boy. And he bounced off of every wall in that room, literally. I mean, he was there and everywhere. And I was overwhelmed. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is real. I had never seen anything like that. And I remember that was the first time being humbled by that experience, because I had never seen a child behave like that before. But then also recognizing that I couldn't just simply go in with the blinders of this kind of radical sense of everything that they tell me in psychology is not real. I think everything in psychology I need to question, but it was a humbling experience to realize, like, okay, there was something wrong. That behavior that I saw in that child that day was not normal. And we ultimately did give him a diagnosis of ADHD. We didn't do brain scans, but then we had other assessments that we could do. And we were able to do those assessments and show that this child had a lot of hyperactivity, a lot of attention issues, that all of these things that you were talking about from an educational perspective of him having difficulty learning and him having to take so much longer with homework and all the things that were going on with him, he was really, really genuinely struggling. And people were telling the grandma, and she was rightfully suspicious, because not everybody that says that has your best interest at heart. But that was a really humbling experience for me. I wonder for you, how do you tell, like, as you're describing your son, how do you tell the difference between, because boy energy is different from girls. So I have a daughter, and boys tend to bounce off the wall. Like my friends that have the boys, they come and they're jumping from one couch to the other and doing all this stuff. And I'm just like, what is going on here?
Yes.
So how do you know the difference between it just male energy versus there's something wrong here?
Yeah, so it's a little more complicated than that. So I would agree. And very early on, a lot of the feedback and communication, I received was, oh, well, he's a boy. He's just a boy. Boys are active. And that's true. Boys are very physically active, and they're socialized to be that way. Girls are socialized. But it's also true that boys are more active if they have things affecting them that then influence them to be active. And so you can have a child with ADHD where their baseline is that they have like a motor going on, like that hyperactive part of the ADHD is like there's a motor running inside, and it just doesn't stop. It just doesn't stop. Yeah. And someone who doesn't have ADHD, when that motor when it's time to sit down to watch a movie or it's time to eat dinner, they are more readily able to sit down and stay down. Right. So the child with ADHD, when it's time to sit and watch the movie, the motor is running, and without even awareness, they're like up and need to move. Now, this is where people often sort of the misnomer about ADHD. They're like, well, if I'm gonna whoop your behind. If you don't sit down and stay in that chair, you're gonna get it. And so then the child sits in the chair. And so the parent is like, well, he can sit, he can be still. So why, what's the problem? Right.
They say when he wants to. Yeah.
Right. Well, certainly under the stress of getting, a beating, most people are going to respond to that. But also one of the things about ADD is that you can learn, right? You can develop skills to be able to be more attentive, to channel the hyperactivity, to get exercise. So you're releasing the energy so that you then can be able to focus, to reduce your anxiety so that then you're not feeling anxious, and that's causing, or creating brain fog. So a lot of times it's a matter of, there are things that compensate that you do and that people with ADD do to compensate. we just don't know it, and we just don't, realize it, and we just don't understand it. Did that make sense or answer sort of?
Yeah, no, that actually clarifies some things for me. And one of the things that I notice sometimes is, part of that comment is like, oh, the child can listen or stay still when they want to. And people aren't thinking like the things as a parent, as a big person, you have a lot of power. And so part of that power is, if you're threatening to spank a child, if you're threatening physical violence, then they're going to use all their resources to try to comply. The other thing that I notice is, and I'm wondering if you can comment on that, is certain things that children like. So part of it would be video games, that they can concentrate a long time on video games, or the iPad. So when my children were little, there was no such thing as an iPad, but iPads, that they can concentrate on that. So can you speak a little bit about that? Why can people with ADHD focus on certain things?
Right. So a part of the cardinal marker of ADHD is that the person has difficulty in paying attention to sort of everyday rote kinds of activities or things where they don't have a great interest. And so, and this really goes back to what you were saying before, and what's really the part of the big myths around and the misconception. Yes, a person with ADD can pay attention, can read, can focus on something, but it takes an additional amount, an enormous sometimes amount of energy and internal resources to be able to do that. So what it might take me to sit down and write a page of information in terms of emotional, psychological, physical resources to just stay in the chair, to then focus on the words, may be very different for someone whose brain doesn't have the neurodiversity. So, it's really important to understand that there are different types and ways that ADD shows up. Some people are going to be hyperactive, but you can have ADD and be inattentive and not have hyperactivity. So where you just have difficulty, focusing on things at any given time, right? And you can have somebody who has what is called anxious ADD. And that's someone who their neurobiology is just where they function being anxious and sort of having an underlying worriedness, social anxiety, like just sort of always in distress. And so that person is going to have more maybe gastrointestinal symptoms and problems associated with the ADD. There's a thing called ring of fire ADD, and that's where you might have a person who experiences more anger, more aggressiveness. They might be sensitive to noise, sensitive to light, and tend to be more rigid at times, and just experience periods of mood change, like really strong and intense mood change. And you have no idea that that's ADD, but that is a part of how it can show up. And all the different ways it shows up, at the core, they have the hallmark of inattention and, being distracted, maybe being disorganized. But depending on sort of the neurodiversity and the complexity of that person's brain and how it works, it can be it can kind of show up very different. And that's why it is important to have assessment.
And talk a little bit about that, because the types of ADHD, so you're talking about these different types of ADHD, but generally when you go to a psychologist, even if you have an assessment, they're not going to give you all those types. So they're not going to talk about the anxious type and the ring of fire and things like that. So where do those descriptions come from?
So those descriptors come out of the work of Daniel Amen and the Amen Clinic. And they are folks who particularly use the brain imaging to help understand the functioning of the brain in order to make assessments of the ADD. Now, you don't need to go the route of having the brain, imaging done. But what it does is it helps to get more specificity with regard to how the brain is functioning. And so, again, if you have someone who tends to be more moody in their ADD versus someone who's hyper, you can then channel and direct the treatment and the intervention that they're going to get more in alignment with that. And so it's okay, if someone gets a traditional ADD assessment, like that's huge. It's a great place to start. And if you have it, like there are really things you can do to begin to address it. But it's important to get that assessment, at least one that says, okay, this attentional deficit challenge is going on, but also then to help rule out, so doing assessment to help rule out if there are other learning or behavioral issues that might be going on that are impairing the child. I know of someone whose son it was third or fourth grade, just having a really hard time with school, just acting out, disruptive in class, just unhappy, moody, really aggressive at times. And then aggressive at times with mom at home, just really being like unmanageable. And the child was assessed and found to have ADD, but the child also had some other traumas that were influencing his behavior of acting out, being angry, being upset and aggressive. And so those things had to be addressed separately, not separately, but they had to be addressed.
Also.
And also, right.
Yeah.
So those things were addressed. The ADD was addressed. And this, kid is now just the happiest little, goofiest, smiling child. So, go ahead.
And I know we're talking a lot about boys. I want us to talk about girls in a second, because I'll bring in my experience with working with girls. But I want to expand this kind of conversation around the types of assessment, because I think that's important to let people know. So one of the things you talked about was brain scans. So you went to the Amen Clinic. I know the Amen Clinic has different sites. There's certainly in New York. I know they have one here in the Metro Atlanta area. There are also assessments. Can you talk a little bit about assessments? And then I want to make some comments about assessments so people know kind of what to look for when we talk about an assessment for ADHD. What specifically, as a psychologist, what will we be talking about?
Yeah, and you're the expert in this area. I do assessments and screenings at times, or I have done them, I should say. And a part of the assessment is one of the biggest and the most important part is getting a clinical history. And getting the background information about the child's life experience from the early on until now. One of the things, again, about the misconceptions of ADD is that, well, everybody got ADD, everybody gets organized, everybody can be inattentive, everybody gets unfocused. And in the ADD and in the assessment, you're looking for a pattern, a long-term pattern where you see it from the child early on, in their educational and personal, social life and experience. And so a clinical interview and assessment does that. It, asks questions that the psychologist asks of the child, and then of the guardian or parental figure. Also does an interview with the teachers at school and any other adults that are having or have regular interface with the child. So it's important to get those multiple touch points in the clinical interview. And then there are screening tools, right? Paper and pen screening tools that you ask questions of the child or the parent to, assess whether or not certain kinds of behaviors are seen on a regular, ongoing basis with the child. And then your assessment may also include screenings for, issues around mood, depression, anxiety, to help rule out whether or not those are, either comorbid, like symptoms that are going along with it, or a part of the presentation of the ADD. And then if there are other learning or behavioral assessments, so doing a full psychological assessment and using traditional psychological batteries to screen for academic skills and educational strengths and deficits, then could also be an important part of that.
Yeah. Thank you. If you have just joined us, I am talking to my colleague, Dr. Ma'at Lewis. She is based in the state of New York, and we were talking about ADHD. What we've established, I asked her the question, is ADHD real? She said yes. I said yes also. And we're trying to give some information about it. And I really want to go further in the conversation a little bit later and talk about, like, what's the difference? Like, how do you know that it's something that would be labeled as ADHD versus a larger clinical issue. I do want to kind of expand what you were saying about like screeners and assessments. For me, what I think is really important when we talk about ADHD, and we do a lot of this testing in our office, is the first thing that happens, because adults come all the time, because like you said, oftentimes in our generation, then lots of people were not diagnosed with ADHD when they were young. And so one of the things that I say to my child psychologist, I was like, well, how come everybody's getting diagnosed with it? And when we were young, that wasn't happening. He's like, people didn't have the tools. They didn't have the language. They didn't know. And so now, like, we have more tools to be able to assess it. So oftentimes what I see is that adults will come and wonder if they have ADHD. And one of the first things that I can do, it goes to what you were saying, is when I do an interview with them, I will ask when the problem started. If the problem started in high school, no. If you were doing fine and then something happened in high school, then there's all kinds of other stuff. You're going to see someone that has ADHD, those problems start very young, that you will see them before 7 years old. You will be able to look back and notice that there are issues, and it's not always behavioral issues. You can have some folks, so I have a child that has ADHD, a girl, and model student, always got good grades. She never had any behavioral issues. She is the child that people want in the class because she is compliant.
Yes.
Never had any behavior issues. So that's one of the things I think is important. The other thing, kind of going to what you were saying, Dr. Lewis, is recognizing that in order to do an assessment of ADHD, first of all, you need to go to a psychologist in a psychology practice. What I notice that is happening, for those of you that want to whip out your insurance card, is a lot of insurance companies are not willing to pay for ADHD testing. They want people to have basic screeners, which I think is dangerous, because they believe that you can do a screener and give a child medication and change a child's brain with pharmaceutical medication. They will pay for that before they will pay for psychological testing. And so I would say to any parent that you should never do that option. Don't allow people to do screeners on your child and make a final diagnosis of ADHD. You should be going to a psychologist and having a comprehensive report, whether that be going into the neuropsychology route and you can do brain scans, or having a full assessment, what we would call an assessment battery, where we look at your cognitive, so like how your brain is functioning. We're looking at how a child is processing information, their academic abilities. We're looking at all of that information and then writing that up in a comprehensive report so we can figure out what is really going on with the child. Because what I noticed that some people are doing with screeners, so they're handing out screeners to teachers, which teachers have no business at all diagnosing anybody with ADHD. They should not even have that word. They should give parents feedback about performance and concerns around performance and behavior, but they should not be suggesting anything about attention or ADHD that is not their lane. Even with pediatricians that refer to us, even though they can give the medication, I love the pediatricians that we work with, because they tell the parents, you have to go to the psychologist and get the diagnosis before we will give you any kind of medication for your child.
Yeah. And can I add to this? And I'm sorry for the light here. Since we moved to Facebook, I had to come outside, and I don't know if you can even see me well.
Barely, but I can
I can try to move in. I can try to move into the light, but I don't want to be too disruptive since we're live. Another misconception is the idea that people who have ADHD and have these difficulties have less intelligence. Okay, there we're getting there. You know, that there's less intelligence. And one of the things that I can, say very strongly is that ADHD is not a measure or an indication of someone's intellectual ability. That what you often find is people who are highly intelligent and who are very skilled in either in general or have skills in a particular area, and the ADD just sort of functions in the ways that it functions to create and required to have to expend additional energy. Like I was a chemistry major in in high school, and so I had some intelligence, but at the same time, one of my classmates would like always throughout the first year of our homeroom, she would always like give me extra assistance, or she would like pull out stuff that we would need. Like and again, this all flashed before me at once I got diagnosed. But back then I didn't realize like she was helping me because I wasn't remembering like the things that we were being told to do, or I was so disorganized, in setting up experiments and things that I would kind of get lost. And it wasn't that I couldn't understand the concepts, but the ADD affected my organizational skills. And so she was, there always, giving me extra tube, making sure my supplies were laid out properly. So again, it's not about intelligence. And something that we should touch on with this is in terms of how people with ADHD, often their self-esteem can greatly be impacted, right? Yeah. That, because I'm trying here, because the person has, difficulties, requires additional energy to do things, they sometimes then have a lot of self-doubt, have a lot of questioning, of themselves, about their intelligence, about their ability. Like, you have an awareness that something's not quite right? You mentioned processing, right? Sometimes for people with ADHD, their ability to process information can be slower than someone else. And so that slowness of processing can mean that when someone's talking to you, the teacher's standing up in front of the class, she's rattling off instructions and you just miss it, or it takes you extra time to get it. And so then when she's moving on to the next thing, you're still trying to catch up with what was just said.
What was the thing before?
Yeah. Just another example, graduate school. I had a classmate. Now, I don't know if this was because of race and racial issues or ADHD, but she would go and to attend meetings with other students, predominantly white students, and then she would come back and share the notes with me. And, just like from time to time, she'd be like, oh, yeah, we had a meeting and we, discussed so-and-so topic, and I just wanted to give you the notes. And at the time I was naive and sort of didn't think about either that meant that they were meeting and, we ain't not meeting with the black girl, right? Or, and she was a good colleague. She was somebody that I, would have called a friend, or she recognized and saw how, in terms of note taking, I was spending extra time, or feverishly writing, trying to take notes during class.
And I think what I'm hearing from you when you're saying that is one of the things that is important to point out again, because you said ADHD has nothing to do with intelligence. I mean, you can be brilliant. I mean, and that's one of the things that I know about you is that you're absolutely brilliant. You got a PhD, and you got a PhD not from like, some run of the mill school. You went to an Ivy League school and got your PhD. And all of that stuff, when you're struggling with ADHD, it's not going to matter so much. I mean, it can seem really fancy, but like you said, if you're struggling and if other people seem like they're getting the information faster and they're being able to process stuff faster, and then not to mention if you're within a community that tells you that ADHD isn't real, that there's nothing wrong with you, that you can do it if you wanted to, that you're lazy. I mean, if you're getting all of this negative feedback, then that's going to wreak havoc on your self-esteem.
Yeah, and it really does. And it really can. It really can. And, I feel fortunate in that I think, and this is, again, something generationally, sort of having, and this may be why many people in our generation didn't have diagnosis, but having very, strict parents and parents that were authoritarian. And so there wasn't a lot of room for me not to do what I was not supposed to do. There wasn't a lot of room for that. And so those skills of like, I just got to do it, were sort of early on developed. And then because I, had half a decent mind, was able to sort of pull that together to be able to get through graduate school and, do these other things. But many of our children, because the community doesn't think it's real, like you said, and really just send harsh messages, and I find myself, even with my own child, sometimes not having patience, right? As much understanding as I have of all of this, I can get impatient because I'm not recognizing and seeing, oh, he's not processing this as quickly. I need to make sure when I'm giving him instructions, I need to make sure I'm saying the instructions so he hears them. Like I can't just yell it. I'm downstairs, he upstairs, and I'm yelling the instructions thinking he's going to understand. No, I need to make sure he's at least hearing the instructions in the first place.
Yeah. And so I never even thought about it until you just said this. So, because we were talking about parents and parenting styles and kind of old school Black parenting styles, at least that I was used to when I was growing up. A lot of that parenting style would be called authoritative. And so it's like children are supposed to be seen, not heard. You're going to do what I say. This is my house. If you don't like it, then that's your problem. It's like ruling with an iron fist. And oftentimes now there's a lot of negativity that's associated with that. And so we prop up the model of authoritative parents, but not authoritarian parents, because authoritarian parents can have your children scared.
Break you down.
Break you down.
Yeah.
And here's the funny thing go ahead. No.
Well, so I think that there's sort of the distinction that I like to make is sort of what was good in some of that kind of old school parenting was that there was consistency. So what people who have ADHD benefit from is routine and consistency, right? So routine in your structure, routine in your day, planning, knowing what's coming. And, sometimes parents who are on it like that is how, they sort of manage the household. And I think that is and can be the sort of useful thing that can come out of some of the old school parenting, but the any belittling, any sort of name calling, just that, it really can affect the self-esteem, which then leads to problems with being anxious and experiencing depression or problems with mood.
So you're actually making me think about kind of a whole other area of conversation and research and looking at maybe reframing some of the positive aspects of that kind of old school Black parenting of having structure, having some rules and boundaries and harsh boundaries. And there was consequence if you overstepped those boundaries. Because one of the things that I realized, and I talk to parents about this all the time, that parents that have more of a laissez-faire, kind of relaxed way of parenting, there's not a lot of structure, and the adult may have the parent may have ADHD, and then their child has ADHD, and their child isn't doing as well. And sometimes I have to point out, like, yeah, but your mama was gonna beat that behind if things didn't happen, and I'm not saying that that's good, but that creates this structure where you have no option but to fit within this box.
Yeah. So, and again, the person can do it, right? When you have ADHD, you can pay attention, you can focus, but it requires and takes an enormous amount of energy. And so that has a cost, right? Like then you have other psychological, physiological impacts, right? Because then, you're getting into the impacts of stress.
Yes.
And then the way in which stress affects then our health and physical health, or then the stress causes you to eat, and you're anxious eating. So yeah, it's very important to be aware that consistency is needed, and that's how I would describe it. Like, yes, you can be firm and consistent, but don't be punitive and harsh and mean and degrading and
those things cause other kinds of issues. You may manage the child's behavior and really in some ways I would think it would be like doing that manages the child's behavior so the adult feels less stressed, but it doesn't really help the child as they get older and they're out.
And it don't help the adult. It doesn't help the adult either, because you yelling and you're screaming and your blood pressure is rising. Right. So it's really not fruitful for either of us. And we don't then get to know what will work. So like really, when you have ADHD, and it's painful because it's a trial and error process. A lot of it is a trial and error process to understand and figure out what needs to happen in order to help you function at your optimal best. And for some people that can be medication. Some people that's getting exercise every day, like getting your walking, getting your biking, whatever it is, like that might be the thing. For other people, it may be supplements. And I'm a strong advocate of, more dietary lifestyle changes for the treatment of ADHD.
And I want to talk a little bit about that. We're going to come to that in just a second. I want you to talk about girls really quick.
Yes.
So how girls might look different, girls that have ADHD, girls that are hyperactive, how those girls may look different than boys.
Yeah. I have two case examples that come to mind. One, a little girl, very bright, lots of energy, and not always bouncing around, but, enough that, her family noticed she was different than the other children, the other other girl siblings. And in school, the young lady was doing well. She was generally doing well in a school that had arts, that had creative expression, like things that she was particularly interested in. And so generally she was sort of doing okay, but there was definitely struggles. And she had a lot of problems with mood. She would easily get depressed, easily get sad. And, her parents knew that something needed to shift. And I bring this example because during the pandemic, the child had to go to remote schooling. And so went from functioning okay in school, again, because she had intelligence. It wasn't a matter of she didn't have intelligence. It just, she got disorganized. She had difficulty keeping up, with the school activities. But because they were things she was interested in, she generally, could rise to the occasion and get those resources going. But when she came home and went to remote schooling, tanked into emotional, just acting out, depressed, really feeling unmotivated, really getting moody. And, then even being more inattentive, more restless, not getting any kinds of exercise, not doing any dance, and just really tanked. And, the family got really concerned because of the emotional and some suicidal ideation that came up because of how much she was struggling and not performing well. Had the young lady assessed, recognized that yes, this was the ADHD, was able to get her back in school. And again, she was then thriving in this environment that sort of kept her active, but also sort of tended to the things that really resonated with her. And that allow her to then be motivated to sort of really use her resources to get extra help with being organized, to meet with an academic advisor to help her, come up with her schedule, and to go into counseling. One other lady that I mentioned, just brilliant, 7 years old, speaking 2 languages, martial arts, doing all kinds of martial arts, just really well-rounded and, skilled, and in a gifted and talented program. Like that's a whole nother thing. It's twice exceptional children. So this young lady who's very intelligent, had lots of skills in other areas, very well-rounded, but just a bundle of worry. And worry to the point where it was disrupting, school and disrupting social relationships and interaction. And, the fact that she was so bright, so intelligent, the family was like, what could possibly, be the problem? There can't be the problem because she's doing fine. But the child started to recognize that, like something's wrong. Like I am not okay. And really, sort of begged and impressed upon the parents, who were, educated and, fairly informed, but impressed upon the parents to say, something's not right. I don't feel right inside, and got assessed. Sure enough, diagnosed with ADD. and started treatment and intervention to begin to help her deal with that anxiety and deal with the sort of that underlying constant tension that was going on for her that created distractibility, that created difficulty with the inattention and problems with focus at times.
And I think I want to go there what you just said about twice exceptional children, because that's something that people don't talk about. And my daughter was labeled as twice exceptional, and I didn't know what that was until they had that label, and I was like, oh, I didn't know. Oh, that's what I'm seeing. Okay, so talk a little bit about that. What is twice exceptional?
So it's a term that's often used for children who may have a diagnosis of some form of learning disorder or ADHD, but then they also are gifted and talented and have, sort of multiple areas of either intellectual strength or creative, kinds of strength. And they sometimes struggle because there's a lack of awareness and understanding of where the strengths are and where the weaknesses are. And so it's really important to, again, get that comprehensive assessment to see what those strengths are, what those weaknesses are, and attend to both.
And I would say that there are a lot of children that where we overlook that. And so often that's the case, because when people, what I'm hearing from people when they have a concern about their child being labeled as ADHD is that in our society, it's a value judgment. And then it's also associated with that, like you said, like maybe that my child isn't intelligent. And no, often the case is that their child is twice exceptional. So my child is completely brilliant, so brilliant. That when she was first tested and diagnosed with ADHD, now actually this is hilarious. She was actually first tested when she was 5 years old, and she was we were practicing as graduate students. And so I let my children be like the practice children.
Yes.
And so one of my colleagues told me at 5 that she was like, she has ADHD. And I was like, nah, so I didn't pay attention. So she actually didn't get formally diagnosed until she was in 11th grade. And she, despite the fact that you could clearly see in her scores, like her processing speed was very slow. So her ability to take in information, do something with that information in her brain, and then spit it back out was very slow. Her memory, terrible. It takes her 50 million times to learn something. Yeah. But even though those scores were low, her overall cognitive scores, her overall IQ was in the average range. That means that her actual IQ is super high. Yeah. Because you got these two scores. So all of it is like these 4 areas and pulled together. And so if you have 2 areas that are really low, then that number should go down a lot. But if her number stayed in the average range, even though you had these 2 low scores, that means her number was really up here and it just pulled it down to average.
Right. Yeah. And you're speaking to the issue of stigma, right? And again, so girls are less often stigmatized because I think the general just socialization around, girls, but it's that stigma that then, keeps us from being able to say, okay, you know what, we need to put some real extra emphasis in giving this child some resources. And then and it's well founded, because we do know that our children get labeled, and historically with many of the ways that school systems work, they were tracked into routes of education that were just totally under representing their gifts and their talents. What I feel now, particularly with the amount of knowledge and information that's out there, is that if you can be informed, and sometimes it's just as simple as the parent is like picking up the book and reading it yourself, like just getting informed yourself as a start, that you can ask questions and you can, really advocate for your child. And so for me, it's less of a concern that my child has a label of ADD than it is that they not then get the supports that they need. Like, I want some supports. I know the resources out there. The research tells us that, the way in which ADD is seen is it is a white, predominantly white disorder, right? That white people are perceived as having it more and diagnosed and getting treatment and intervention. And then the clinicians and the people who provide that treatment and intervention are predominantly white. And so there's lots of potential for implicit bias for our children not to then get the supports and services that they need. And again, those could be, included in the school and having an educational plan, or it could be simple as, getting that child some real structure that is going to help them have a routine where they function and thrive the best.
Yeah. Listen, and kind of for this last portion, I want to talk about interventions and help. So where do you stand on medication? So there's all kinds of Vyvanse, Adderall, you name it. They've got it. They got a pill for it. What are your thoughts about medication?
Yeah, so there's, two primary classes of medication that act as stimulants and help to, address symptoms, typically your classic ADD. And those medications can work and do work for some people, right? They do help if someone is having trouble focusing, they can help to focus. Where I pause and have lots of cause and caution is that, they too have side effects, right? And they too, not always, all the research doesn't show it to always be the case, but they can have an impact on a developing, growing child.
Yes.
And so my position is, if you can, seek and try alternative interventions, then that is sort of the first line that I take. But it really needs to be in consultation, with your healthcare provider, with a physician, but not just any old physician. So you really, if you're getting support and treatment for ADD, you need a functional medicine doctor, or what's called an integrative, practitioner. Someone who, or, a holistic practitioner, someone who is both knowledgeable about medication and is knowledgeable about holistic, alternative treatment. And there's a book, you talk about resources. So there's a book, again, I have no financial stake in this, called Finally Focused, by James Greenblatt. And
I think I'm gonna put it in the thing.
Okay. And so that book sort of is a good resource for helping you kind of understand that, yes, you can, and some children may need or choose to go on medication. Again, that the little boy who was having the problem that I described before, he is on medication, and it helped. Like, saw a stark change in him. In my family, we don't use medication, but we practice lifestyle changes, our diet. My own personal experience, I'm 100% see the benefits of having a diet that removes certain substances and things that may be not create the ADD, but exacerbate it. So this book, Finally Focused, helps you to make an assessment of types of things you may need to add in terms of supplements, and the types of things you may need to remove that cause detriment, like just allergies you may have, processed foods. For some people, it means a decrease in, if you're a meat eater, a decrease in certain kinds of, red meat. So there definitely is opportunity to take medication and try it if that's what, is in alignment with you and your family. I think for young children, it's important that if you can expend the energy to engage in alternatives, that you try that, and because they also really do work and really can help. Sometimes something as, and I'm not trying to simplify it, but sometimes something as simple as like making sure that your child gets outside every day, twice a day, and plays hard, right? In the pandemic, that was extremely difficult, but certainly would make the symptoms worse,
Yes.
Just taking out soda, like, I can't even tell you last time we had soda in my family household, but for some, that's maybe something that's a norm, but soda has a lot of sugar. Sugar is not what creates ADD, but it makes it and can make it worse. And it makes any child, right, hyper and can make them agitated.
So I'm gonna seem like the extreme mommy.
Mm-hmm.
My position is, if your child has ADHD, your child does not. I don't think children need to be eating a lot of sugar. Period. Point blank. But if your child has ADHD, your child does not need sugar at all, because sugar they will be. Just think about it. Like, if you eat sugar yourself, I know if I eat sugar, then I'm on a high. I feel like I've used drugs. And so as an adult that does not have ADHD, if I'm eating sugar, what do you think it's doing to a child that has attention problems? So I'm not going to just say, don't eat sodas. I'm going to go as far, and I tell parents all the time, eliminate the sugar, period, point blank.
Yeah.
You need to have, and I think your diet has to have as much whole foods, natural ingredients. If you can eat organic, great. If you can't eat organic, lots of live vegetables, not tons of stuff from cans, not tons of stuff that's frozen. Definitely, like you were saying, not the processed food, because that just makes the situation worse.
Yeah. So what the processed foods, they slow down the processing. And they slow down the processing within the body. And live foods provide live active nutrients. So I go the extreme in terms of advocating for organic. And again, I know it's sort of more costly and more expensive to eat organic, but the chemicals that are often used on fruits and vegetables, you can look it up. And even in the book, I think it talks a little bit about, there are some foods that are fruits and vegetables that you can sort of not necessarily have to do organic, and things that, have their own shell or skin. But because of the chemicals that are used on food, they too have an impact on the brain. When you eat them, they then affect the brain and can have an influence on someone who has ADD, who's predisposed and vulnerable. And I agree with you, absolutely. Sugar affects all of us, right? It affects all of us, and I don't eat sugar myself. I guess so. I really believe.
I'm not gonna lie. I eat sugar, but I'm just saying, if I had ADHD, I wouldn't eat sugar.
But it really does have an. But these are also hard choices. So most of my family and community, they feel I'm rather extreme, but the proof is in how I feel. And so that's sort of where you have to me, draw the line. The other major thing with ADD is sleep. So we talked about, you need exercise. Right. You need to monitor your diet, eating a more clean, whole foods, supplementation, make sure you're getting omega-3s, and then sleep. So if I had to, rank things, I would probably put sleep at the top in terms of, for someone with ADHD, you must get rest and be rested. When you don't, whatever the complex processes are that occur in the brain that affect us when we are sleep deprived and don't get deficient sleep, they are tenfold in people with ADD. And so, to whatever extent, and we know that our children in American culture and society, are sleep deprived and stay up real late and have to get up real early, for school. And so, and now with, electronics, not only are they not getting adequate sleep, but their brains are being overstimulated by the blue light, of using devices. So, and again, I'm not making any particular recommendations, but using like blue light filtering glasses to help reduce the impact of the blue light can help sort of decrease the agitation. And this is for anybody, whether you have ADD or not, but especially in ADD, if you are staring at the computer screen and getting exposed to the blue light, it triggers the brain, to be more on and more active. It makes it more difficult to go to sleep. And so for somebody with ADHD, they have to have a sleep routine, turn off the devices, 30 minutes to an hour before it's time to go to sleep, and really making sure you get that rest. And that, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to add to that. I think also, absolutely, I mean, children need to have limited interaction with kind of social media and electronic devices. But really, when folks have ADHD, your child does not, and I find this is really intriguing because, like I said, the tablets didn't exist when my children were little. And so I see children that are out places and they're constantly staring at the tablets. So they don't even ask their parents, when are we leaving? Because they're focused on the tablet for hours and hours and hours. That is not going to be healthy for your child.
Yeah. Again, the screens have an impact on the brain. They trigger the brain to, have seek more stimulation, seek more activity. So for the ADD brain, right, the neurodiversity of the ADD brain, when you sit down to focus on a task, your brain already is wired to have need extra energy and resources to sit down and focus on that screen. If you are someone who's been using the computer a lot, using games and stimulations, it then challenges the brain all the more to quiet itself to gain that attention and that focus. Breathing exercises, relaxation, meditation are also good skills and things that children need to learn in order to help them in managing ADHD. It teaches the body to calm down. It teaches the mind to calm down and to develop the ability to, over time, learn how to focus.
Yeah. This has been a lot. Yeah. The only other thing that I think we should cut, one more thing, is this processing speed. Like, what does this mean? So I said it's like taking in information, turning it around in your head, and spitting it out. For me, the feedback that I get from my staff, and I did not know this until I started running a business, is that I have an extremely fast processing speed. I thought my processing speed was normal. So you were even laughing at me. I'm like starting up over here and going over here and doing something like that. And I do stuff, boom, 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 boom. I can literally just crank stuff out. And my staff is like, I remember my second doctoral student. He came to me one day, closed the door, and he was like, I just need to let you know your processing speed isn't normal, because I was expecting people to function at my level. And so that becomes really interesting, having a child whose processing speed is super slow.
Yeah. And again, it's not a lack of intelligence, right? So that processing slowness means when the information comes in, it sort of, takes a little longer for it to get to where it needs to in order for the brain to then decide what it wants to do with it and then send a message back out. And sometimes that can take the form of, even like when the person is speaking, if you're not listening carefully, like you just don't even get it in to be able to respond. And I many years I sort of would wonder why, why sometimes when people would talk to me, I wouldn't understand what they were saying. But it just took me longer to even take in what they're saying. So it's a process of the brain just not moving in that readily with speed. And so for example, if someone speaks to me again, it may mean that I need to write down what they say in order for it to get in order for me to, I need to see it so I can visually process, right? If I have a stronger visual processing, if I write it down, then my brain is going to be able to take it in visually, not just auditorially. And then I can be able to make sense of it and spit it back out. So that's a big one that people don't even, sort of realize.
But here's the thing that you do. And so this actually makes me think further. So the time when we don't have to describe what this was, but when you were sitting there and listening, I was there with someone and I'm talking to Adikemi. And so I'm listening to this conversation and you transcribe the conversation almost word for word. So why is it that your brain can do that?
So again, a nuance of ADHD is that the person can have challenge with focus, but one of the sort of types and another way it can manifest is for the person to be over focused, which means when there's something that's occurring that the person is interested in or that they are tuned into, then they can really be tuned into it. So in high school, I learned to type and, develop the ability to type. And so now if I'm listening to a lecture or a talk or someone speaking, I can type and listen, with real good accuracy, acuteness, and take in everything that's being said. It's because once I'm tuned in, then I can really stay with it. But if I don't get in, if I'm not, if I don't get into what it is, then it's problematic. And it can be problematic for people with ADD to be over focused. So where you sit down, you start working on something, and then 4 hours have gone by and you've forgotten to eat, you've forgotten to go to the bathroom, you forgot to pick up your child from school, like, because you get, because again, it's not that the brain can't do it. It can't do things. It just, some things sort of function at a different rate and with different emphasis and require different amounts of resources. And challenge is to know thyself enough, know yourself, get to understand yourself enough, get to understand your child enough to know, well, what are those strengths and weaknesses? What are the things that we can do to compensate for where the weaknesses are that are going to allow this child to thrive? So it's like when you think about accommodations for ADHD, right? Some people may receive an accommodation where they're allowed to, type and use a computer when in class, because they may process better, auditorially, or maybe process better visually. But you have to sort of figure that out for each person.
Okay, so this conversation, so we're gonna have to have a second conversation.
Part two.
We definitely have to have part two of this. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking, one of the things as a parent, recognizing my own processing speed, and then I have a child that has a slower processing speed, that I have to be patient. I have to be more patient, because where I'm thinking, okay, so you're not paying attention to me, or you're not listening, or you just didn't do that because, and instead of interpreting it as disrespect or that the person's not paying attention, it means like y'all are processing stuff at two different speeds.
Yes. And again, with someone who has problems with inattention, if you're talking and their attention, in order for them to pay attention, they have to really, again, use extra energy and resources to pay attention. So you're saying things and they're not hearing it. Like, they're just not even hearing it. So yes, that looks like disrespect, looks like you're not paying attention to me, but it's the brain is not taking in information. So you have to learn, like, oh, okay, my child, when you talk to them, if you're standing behind them, they're not going to hear. They're not going to be able to take it in. So you need to make sure you get their attention when you want to give instructions, know?
Okay. Doctor, I forgot to ask people if they had questions earlier. I totally forgot. I think because I was just I got focused in the conversation because it's so interesting.
So and it's an important conversation.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
You are welcome. I'm appreciative to be able to have the space to share it, and hopefully something of what we've said has been beneficial. Can I just add one more resource?
Please. Yeah.
So there is this website called Attitude. It's a online magazine. I think the website is attitudemag.com. Or if you type in mag.com, and or you can just type in, attitude and ADHD or attitude ADD, and it should come up. And it is a wealth of resources. So if you are looking for some place to start, that is the place to start. It's a organization that sponsors webinars, sponsors all kinds of pamphlets, booklets, brochures. They have a little screening, not a little screening, but a little, sort of questionnaire to kind of help you even get a sense of what the issue is. So that is a place to start if you don't know where to begin to get information. It just has a ton of information. And again, I have no financial interest in the Amen clinics, but they are also, I find, a good resource of information, as well as, the services that they offer.
Amen clinics. Okay, I'm gonna try to put that on. And then tell us, Alethea was asking about the first book.
Yeah, Finally Focused. I mean, that book I really love, and that and these are Euro descent, folks, because there's not a lot of research or people doing ADHD. Or maybe I should look that up a little more. But the Finally Focused book, James Greenblatt, he's a psychiatrist, and he is a functional, medicine doctor. And has come up with a sort of perspective, again, that in order to treat ADD, you take what he calls a plus minus approach. Plus are things you need to add into your life. So supplementation, magnesium, omega-3s, and then minus, removing processed foods, removing allergens, removing things that, might exacerbate and make your symptoms worse. And so it really is a really good, checklist in terms of the way the chapters are organized that you can start to assess. And, this is many people like to get a pill. There are many parents and family members who are like, just give me the pill, just give my child the medication. I just want this to get better. And, every family has to make that decision. But I can't say enough about the importance of taking the time to understand your child, understand yourself, and what are, the trial and error of learning what works for you. You need to become, your own best health advocate and have a network of support or coach or a functional, doctor or psychologist who's informed, or an ADD coach to help you. And that's another resource, is getting an ADD coach, someone who can begin to, once you have a diagnosis and have a sense of medically what you need, having a coach is a good person to support you in creating the lifestyle changes that you might need to make.
I see Joan. Joan has a question. She's in Guyana. And so, Joan, if you have your question, do me a favor, put it in the chat, and I will certainly ask Dr. Lewis the question. Daniel Amen, yes, Alethea was asking us at Daniel Amen at the Amen clinics. Do me, Dr. Lewis, that was a second book. The very first book that you...
sorry. So Daniel Amen's Healing ADD was the first book.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And then the second book was Finally Focused.
I put the Finally Focused in the chat.
Yeah. And so the first one was Healing ADD.
Oh, Healing ADD. Okay. ADD.
Yeah.
I'm going to put all of those. Oh, I see it. Okay. That's a Daniel Amen book, Healing ADD. Oh, and it's on Audible. A sister like me loves some Audible.
Yeah.
I got more time to listen than sit down and crack open a book. So I love Audible. Okay, I will put that in. So, Joan, I'm waiting for your question, because she said she has a question. She says, I have a question, mental health in Guyana. I don't know if Joan is connected to Dr. Don Stewart down there in Guyana.
And certainly culturally, and in terms of different regions and states and countries, you're going to see differences in the way, ADD is viewed and the way in which, it manifests. And I think, cultural norms and practices around children and, that can also make a difference. But it's a thing. It is a thing.
And actually, I'm glad that you said that, because oftentimes I've been to Guyana, I've been to, lots of places traveling. And as a psychologist, people want me to tell them what a particular disorder looks like in their country. And I always tell them that one of the things that I am against is psychological colonialism. I do not believe in taking what it is that we have culturally here and then taking my Western skills as a psychologist and imposing that on other people. So you're right, even though that, and I lost Dr. Lewis, hopefully she comes back, even though ADHD may exist in a different country, it may look a lot different. And so it's really important to know that if you're in a different country, everything is going to be based on what the cultural norms are. If in a particular country, then if children may be more active than they are here. And so what you're always looking for any kind of mental health condition is the behavior outside of what is culturally normal for that particular population. Dr. Lewis, did I still lose you? I don't know. I might have lost her. Joan, so if you have a question, you can still put it in. We're going to go off because I think I might have lost her. What about a conference in Guyana? Joan, we were working on that. We were trying to come to Guyana in 2020. And then a big old global pandemic happened. So yes, that is one of the things that we are working on. We have to get past the pandemic. So my folks that are in Guyana, my folks that are in Paris, Black Paris, you know that we are coming. My folks in Senegal, we are coming. So yep, we lost Dr. Lewis. Listen, everyone, thank you for hanging out during this conversation. Do me a favor. Again, I always say, if you like this video, if this information was helpful to you, please share it by just clicking the share button. Please like this video, leave us a comment. Even after we go offline, leave us a comment, leave us a question. I can always have Dr. Lewis answer those questions. I just appreciate that you showed up on this Wednesday. Typically, we are on Instagram on Wednesdays at 3:00. This was just a little bit different today because we were trying to work out the technical difficulties. There's Dr. Lewis coming back. She's still, I don't know what happened to her. So she's still not there. But again, thank you for hanging out with us. We definitely have to get Dr. Lewis back to do a part 2. Yes, Joan, Dr. Dawn Stewart, I thought she said hi earlier. She might have said hi on my personal platform. She is down. Thank you, Joan. She is down in Guyana. Oh, there she is. Okay, so let's see. I was just wrapping up, Dr. Lewis.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's all right. So, Joan, I will definitely put a comment in and link Dr. Stewart down in Guyana. She's in Georgetown. I will link her so you can connect with her. So she is somebody that is down in Guyana. I do think this is an ongoing conversation, and to think about this as a broader conversation for communities of African descent and how people show up with ADHD within different communities, because Joan is asking about Guyana. I think that's part of this ongoing conversation for us. So again, thank you, Dr. Lewis.
You are welcome, and thank you.
Okay, take care, everyone.